They thought she was just another broke woman in a thrift store t-shirt. So they laughed, ignored her, and showed her the door. But the next day, a Rolls-Royce pulled up, and everything changed. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Linda Parker stepped into the sleek, glass-walled showroom with the kind of smile that came from quiet excitement. She wore a soft gray t-shirt tucked into a pair of well-worn jeans. Her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. It wasn't the kind of outfit most people expected to see in a place lined with six-figure vehicles. But to her, comfort always came first. Today was about her sister, not appearances. As she crossed the polished marble floor, a few salespeople exchanged glances. One leaned slightly toward the other and muttered something with a crooked grin. Linda didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. It was the same tone she'd heard years ago when she walked into a high-end store and the clerk pretended not to see her. Still, she kept walking. A tall man in a tailored navy suit appeared from behind a glass office. His name tag read, Scott Miller, Sales Manager. He approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking her over like she was an unopened box with the label smudged. Linda returned his smile politely. "Yes, I'm looking to buy a car, something special. It's for my sister's birthday. She's turning 50, and she's been dreaming about a new convertible." Scott's eyebrow lifted just enough to betray his skepticism. "Do you have a specific model in mind?" he asked, voice calm, but clipped. "The midnight blue cabriolet," she said confidently, her eyes glinting with excitement. "I read it has the smoothest suspension in its class." Scott's smile twitched. "That's one of our more exclusive models," he replied, glancing toward the front desk. Then back at her. "Do you have an appointment? Usually clients looking at that tier of vehicle schedule in advance." Linda's smile faltered. "No, I didn't realize I needed one. I just wanted to see the car today. If it's a good fit, I'd like to move forward." Scott gave a soft chuckle and shook his head gently. "Well, that's admirable," he said, "but to be honest, that vehicle may not be within everyone's budget. We can certainly look at other options if you'd like." From across the room, a young salesman paused mid-sentence with his customer. Watching the exchange, his face shifted slightly, something between discomfort and indecision, but he stayed quiet. Linda took a breath, steady and low. "I thought showrooms were for buyers," she said softly, "not for judging who's worth serving." Scott offered a tight, dismissive smile. "Of course, but we do try to provide personalized service to those who match our client profile. You understand." There was nothing loud about the moment. No yelling, no security called, just a quiet dismissal, wrapped in manners and coded in assumptions. Linda nodded once. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply turned, thanked him for his time, and walked out. As the doors closed behind her, she felt the weight of invisible eyes still on her back. She didn't look back. Her hands didn't shake, but her chest tightened with that old, familiar ache. The one that comes when someone looks straight through you. Out on the sidewalk, the California sun hit her face. She looked up at the sky and let the silence settle in. It wasn't the rejection that stung, it was the quiet certainty in Scott's voice. As if he was doing her a favor by turning her away. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message. Then she slipped it back into her pocket, and walked toward the parking lot without a word. The next morning, the showroom was buzzing, but not because of any new car arrival. The real entertainment, it seemed, was the story of the woman in jeans who'd come in wanting to buy a luxury convertible. I mean, she walked in like she owned the place. One of the salesmen chuckled, polishing his watch as if the memory still amused him. Asked for the midnight blue cabriolet like she had 6 figures in her back pocket. Scott stood nearby, grinning, basking in the attention. "You just know," he said confidently, tapping the side of his temple. "Experience. You learn to spot the serious buyers. The rest? Just window shoppers with a dream and no checkbook." The group laughed. Near the corner, a young intern named Marcus kept quiet. It was only his second month on the job, and while he didn't feel it was his place to speak up, something about the way they talked didn't sit right with him. He had been raised by a single mom who worked 2 jobs and still drove him to school in a 20-year-old sedan. He knew better than to judge someone by their shoes. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Linda sat at a quiet coffee shop. She wasn't reading, wasn't scrolling through her phone. Her hands cupped a mug of tea that had long since gone lukewarm. The memory from the showroom played back in her mind. Not the words exactly, but the feeling, that silent judgment, that sense of being weighed and dismissed before she had a chance to speak. She hadn't told anyone what had happened. Not her sister, not even David, but the way her fingers gripped the edge of the cup said plenty. Her back was straight, her jaw set, not in anger, but in a quiet kind of resolve. Back at the showroom, Scott was in his element. He walked a middle-aged couple through a display of custom interiors, bragging about the kind of clientele they typically worked with. We see a lot of professionals here, executives, athletes, entertainers, people who know exactly what they want and can afford it. That's when the front door opened, and a man stepped inside. He wasn't dressed like a typical buyer either, no designer suit, no entourage, but there was something about the way he walked. Calm, measured, like he wasn't there to be impressed. The receptionist straightened in her chair. She recognized him before Scott did. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Orion Motors. May I help?" David Parker held up a hand gently. "I'm looking for Scott Miller," he said, his voice even, almost pleasant. Scott turned around, mid-sentence, only to find the man now standing a few feet away. For a second, Scott didn't recognize him. Then it clicked. David Parker, the founder of Energen, the renewable energy company that had made national headlines for its rapid growth and its founder's low-profile generosity. Forbes had run a feature on him just last spring. The air shifted. David's eyes didn't scan the showroom. He looked straight at Scott. "I believe you met my wife yesterday," he said. Scott blinked. For the first time that morning, his smile didn't come so easily. There was silence. Near the back, the man wiping down the glass display cases let out a low whistle under his breath and muttered just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Funny thing about folks who dress simple," he said, still wiping. "They're often the ones holding all the power." Marcus nodded slightly, not smiling, just watching. Something was shifting in the room. And it wasn't just the air conditioning. Scott cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Of course. Yes, I recall, Mrs. Parker. There must have been a misunderstanding." David didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Let's sit down. I'd like to discuss what happened, and what comes next." From the corner of the showroom, Marcus watched Scott lead David toward the private office with all the enthusiasm of someone walking to a dentist's chair. For the first time since Marcus started the job, he felt like the rules of this place were about to change. David Parker stepped into the showroom with the kind of quiet confidence that turned heads without trying. He wore a charcoal gray blazer over a crisp white shirt. No tie, no flashy watch, just a steady calm in every step he took. His presence didn't announce itself with noise, but with weight. The receptionist stood up so fast her chair bumped the wall behind her. Her voice lifted slightly as she greeted him, already reaching for the phone. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" David offered a polite nod. "I'd like to speak with Scott Miller." She hesitated for a beat, then picked up the phone. Less than a minute later, Scott appeared, still wearing the same smug confidence he'd had the day before. He had no idea who he was about to face. "Welcome to Orion Motors," Scott said with a smile. "I'm Scott Miller, head of sales. What can I help you find today?" David didn't shake his hand. "I'm here to purchase a car for my wife," he said evenly. "She came in yesterday, asked about a specific model. The midnight blue cabriolet. I believe you spoke with her." Scott's face didn't change right away, but his eyes flicked, trying to search the memory. He chuckled awkwardly. "Ah, yes, of course. It's a very popular model. May I ask who your wife is again?" David didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly, gesturing toward the showroom floor. "Before we go any further, I'd like all your sales staff to come over here for a moment." Scott blinked. "Sir?" "Everyone," David repeated. Now, his tone wasn't loud. He didn't raise his voice, but something in it made people move. One by one, the employees stopped what they were doing and gathered near the center of the showroom. Even the janitor with the glass cleaning spray paused, stepping to the side with his bottle still in hand. David looked at each of them. His gaze didn't hold anger, just a calm that cut deeper. Yesterday, he said, my wife came into this showroom. She wasn't dressed like a celebrity. She wasn't wearing heels or diamonds. But she came here with the full intention of buying a car for her sister's birthday. No one spoke. She asked about a specific model. She was polite, clear, and prepared to pay that day. But instead of being treated like a customer, she was sized up and dismissed because she didn't fit what someone here thought a real buyer should look like. David's voice remained level, but the silence around him thickened. Even the air seemed to pause. Scott shifted his weight. The smile on his face had vanished. David's eyes settled on him. I'm not here to scold anyone. He continued, I'm here because I believe in making things teachable. So let me be very clear. You don't get to judge people by what they wear. You don't get to decide who's worthy of respect. That's not your call. A long beat passed. Then David turned to Scott. I'd like you to arrange delivery of the Midnight Blue Cabriolet to the Hope Shelter downtown. It's a safe haven for women recovering from domestic abuse. That was my wife's suggestion last night, and I fully agree. Scott blinked. Sir, David held up a hand. This isn't about making up for yesterday. It's about understanding what kind of place this is going to be moving forward. Scott swallowed, then nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. And the apology, David added quietly, shouldn't come to me. He turned, walking away from the group, leaving the echo of his words hanging heavy in the air. Behind him, Marcus, the young intern, stood still. Something in his chest shifted, like the world had cracked open just enough to let in a bit of clarity. The glass cleaner leaned on his cart, watching David walk away. He didn't smile, just whispered, about time somebody said it. Outside, David didn't check his phone. He didn't look back. He just opened the door, stepped into the warm morning sun and let the silence of the street wrap around him like a promise. By Monday morning, whispers had turned into phone calls. Across the state, from Santa Monica to Sacramento, showroom managers under the same dealership umbrella were receiving quiet directives from corporate. The subject lines were vague: urgent staff meeting, updated customer relations protocol, but the content was clear. Retrain your teams, review ethical conduct, and above all, do not let this story spiral further. Inside the San Diego showroom, the atmosphere had changed. Scott Miller, once the confident centerpiece of the sales floor, sat behind closed office blinds, reviewing paperwork he'd never bothered with before. He'd been asked to temporarily step down, pending internal review. No termination, not yet, but the pressure, it was there, thick in the air. Even the newest intern could feel it. He'd written his statement 3 times already. None of them sounded like him. Because if he were honest, he still didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. Not really. He just misjudged. That's all. And now, somehow, everyone was acting like he'd committed some moral crime. In the break room, conversation dipped into hushed tones whenever someone passed by. 2 sales associates who had laughed about that woman in jeans now avoided the subject entirely. A few offered vague comments about corporate overreacting, but their voices lacked the certainty they'd had a few days earlier. Marcus, the intern, sat at a corner table during lunch, typing something on his phone. He hesitated, then hit send. His message was short, a little awkward, but sincere. Ms. Parker, I was there the day you came in. I didn't speak up when I should have. I'm sorry for staying quiet. I've been thinking about it ever since. He stared at the screen for a moment, then tucked the phone back into his pocket. Miles away, Linda was browsing a small boutique with her sister, Rebecca. The birthday was coming up, and she'd promised a shopping day, just the 2 of them. No distractions. When her phone buzzed, she almost didn't check it, but she glanced down, read the message, and stopped mid-step. Rebecca looked over. Everything okay? Linda smiled faintly. Just someone trying to do the right thing. A little late, but better than never. Rebecca didn't press. They moved on to the next shelf. Back in San Diego, another story had started to unfold, not in boardrooms, but online. A customer who had witnessed the showroom incident, someone no one remembered noticing, had shared a long post on social media. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even dramatic. Just a detailed account of what she saw, what she felt, and what she realized. She praised Linda's grace and David's quiet strength. And the post found its way to the right people. The headline from a local blog followed by Tuesday morning. The woman in the t-shirt. A lesson in humility at a luxury car dealership. Other platforms picked it up. The image of Linda, snapped from a security camera, later leaked anonymously, spread across forums and news feeds. She wasn't posing. She was just walking out the door. Her back straight, her head held high. Inside the Parker home, things remained quiet. David worked late, as usual, but that evening, they sat down for dinner without the usual hum of TV in the background. Linda picked at her food, then looked up. "Do you think we went too far?" David didn't look away from his plate at first. Then he set down his fork and met her eyes. "No," he said, "if we hadn't said something now, someone else, someone without a voice, would have walked into a place like that tomorrow and been treated the same way. And maybe no one would have noticed." Linda didn't respond right away. She turned to the window beside the dining table, the orange-pink glow of the setting sun resting gently on the glass. Her face was calm, not cold, not triumphant, just still. It wasn't about the car anymore. Maybe it never had been. It was about being seen. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone had truly looked. The name on the glass door hadn't changed, and the luxury cars still gleamed under showroom lights. But something inside the San Diego dealership felt different now. The atmosphere had shifted. Where there was once easy confidence, now there was caution. Conversations that used to be loud and careless were quieter, more guarded. Scott Miller was no longer behind the front desk, no longer striding across the polished floors with his rehearsed charm. Officially, he was on administrative leave, pending the results of a company review. Unofficially, everyone knew he was in trouble. Corporate had moved fast. A new manager had been assigned, Elena, a senior salesperson from the Santa Ana branch. She was calm, competent, and made it clear from day one that professionalism would be expected from every member of the team. Her presence was a message in itself. Still, the damage lingered. An internal meeting was held behind closed doors, attended by upper management from the regional office. Words like rebuilding trust, brand image, and restoring confidence were repeated, each delivered with careful neutrality, avoiding direct blame. No one mentioned Linda's name, but everyone knew why they were there. Later that week, Linda received a message through one of the foundation's contact channels. It was from a man named Anthony Vargas. He'd worked with Scott Miller years ago at another location, before transferring out due to what he called creative differences. Linda hesitated before responding, but curiosity outweighed hesitation. They agreed to meet at a small cafe. Low-key and quiet, Anthony was in his mid-40s, wore a plain button-up shirt, and carried himself with a sort of calm that only came from watching too much happen without being able to change it. "I saw the article," he said after they ordered, "and the video. I wasn't surprised." Linda looked up, unsure what he meant. "I worked under Scott for almost a year." Anthony continued, "And this wasn't the first time. He's always been like that. Judged people based on how they looked, what they wore, how they talked, especially women of color." He paused, letting the words settle. "There was this single mom," he said, 3 kids. She came in with a down payment ready. Clean credit. He told her the cars were probably out of her price range and recommended she try something more realistic. She walked out crying. Linda tightened her grip on the coffee cup. She didn't speak right away. "I just thought you should know." Anthony added, "It wasn't just you." That night, Linda sat in her home office and typed the woman's name into a search bar, pulling up a review from years ago, buried in a forum. It was a long, emotional post describing an experience almost identical to her own. It ended with a line that stuck with her. "I left feeling like I didn't belong in a place I had every right to be." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. It wasn't personal, it was patterned. At the Women's Center, where the car had been delivered just a week earlier, she was invited to speak during a small event. Nothing big, just a few community leaders, volunteers, and families gathering to thank donors and share stories. Linda almost said no, but when she stood in that modest rec room, Surrounded by women who'd been through worse than she had, she found her voice. She didn't name names. She didn't point fingers. She just told her story. It wasn't about buying a car, she said, steady and calm. It was about being seen, being treated with dignity. That day, I realized that some people look right through you the second they decide you don't belong. Someone filmed it, just a short clip on a phone, and posted it online that evening. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. The title read, "Never judge by appearance." Comments poured in, not just sympathy, but outrage, and not just at one dealership, but at the pattern, the culture, the quiet, constant practice of measuring people's worth by their shoes, their clothes, their tone of voice. It was no longer about Linda alone. The ripples were spreading. The morning sun filtered through the tinted windows of the corporate headquarters, casting long, pale streaks across the polished floors. In the executive boardroom, a group of regional managers sat around an oval table, each holding a freshly printed directive, a full review of all customer service procedures across the brand's high-end showrooms. The memo didn't name anyone. It didn't mention San Diego, or Linda, or even Scott, but no one in the room missed the implication. The incident had become a ripple, and now that ripple was turning into a wave. Some managers were defensive, whispering in corners, "It's ridiculous. One moment of misjudgment and your entire reputation is gone. Corporates just panicking. They want someone to blame." But beneath the surface, the tension ran deeper than just fear of punishment. Something had shifted. The silence that used to blanket these situations was beginning to fray. In staff rooms, break areas, and late-night texts between employees, stories began to surface, not just about Scott, but others. A pattern, a culture, and for the first time, people were actually talking about it. At the San Diego showroom, James, one of the senior technicians who had worked there for over a decade, brought up a memory during a casual lunch with new staff. 2 years ago, he said quietly, a guy came in wearing gym clothes, wanted to buy an S-Class in cash. Scott looked him up and down, then canceled the deal before it even started, told him we didn't hold test drives for people who might not be serious buyers. Turned out the man owned a chain of health clubs. James shrugged, his voice low. No one said anything. We were scared, or maybe we thought that's just how this business works. But not everyone was staying quiet anymore. Linda, meanwhile, had been approached by a nonprofit group advocating for consumer rights. They asked her to partner on a campaign titled, "Respect is Not Optional," aimed at raising awareness about customer profiling in high-end services. She sat with the offer for days. Her name was already in the headlines. Her story floating from inbox to inbox, podcast to news segment. She hadn't asked for any of it. Now, they wanted her to step forward again, but this time with intention. With a message. David watched her one evening as she stood near the window, arms crossed, deep in thought. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said softly, "but if telling your truth helps someone else, maybe it's worth it." She looked at him, uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't want to turn this into something performative." "You won't," he said, "not if you stay true to what matters." Just when she'd started to lean toward yes, an anonymous email arrived. The subject line read, "I couldn't stay silent anymore." Inside was a brief message, written with careful anonymity, from someone who had once worked under Scott Miller at another branch. Attached was a document, screenshots of internal complaints, customer feedback forms that had been marked, resolved, but never addressed. Reports flagged for sensitivity review, and then shelved. The email ended simply, "You're not the only one." Linda stared at the screen for a long time. That night, she met David in the kitchen, holding a printout of the complaints. "I think I have to do something," she said, not to name him, not to shame anyone, but to give people like this a place to be heard. Together, they drafted a short letter. It wasn't a formal accusation. It wasn't angry. It was an invitation. In the post she published, Linda wrote, "If you've ever been turned away, talked down to, or dismissed because of what you looked like, what you wore, or what someone assumed about you, I see you. I've been you, and now, there's a place to speak." She launched a small website. No branding, no donation links, just a simple form, allowing people to submit stories, anonymously if they wished. By midnight, There were already 15 entries. Stories from across the country. Some were just a few sentences. Some spanned paragraphs. A man in Nevada turned away from a watch boutique because of his accent. A woman in New York dismissed at a hotel check-in desk until her assistant handed over a business card. A teenager in Houston asked to leave a car dealership because he was just browsing. Linda read each one, and as she did, something inside her settled. This wasn't about one man, or one showroom. It never had been. It was about a system built on assumptions and the quiet, steady unraveling that happens when people stop staying silent. By the end of the week, Linda's anonymous platform had received over 100 submissions. Each one came from a different voice, a different town, a different shade of hurt, but the pattern was unmistakable. There were mothers turned away from luxury counters for just browsing, veterans ignored at jewelry stores, and young black men followed around dealerships like shadows clinging to suspicion. One message, though, stayed with her. It was a handwritten letter scanned and sent as a photo attachment. The sender signed it, Marlene Thomas. Marlene introduced herself simply, a single mother, community volunteer, and part-time nurse. She wrote about walking into the same San Diego showroom nearly a year ago, with her toddler in tow and hope in her eyes. She had spent months saving up for a used but well-maintained luxury SUV. She had even called ahead. But when she arrived, the man at the front desk, Scott, barely looked at her. She remembered the way his words curled when he said, "We don't do tours for browsers." She remembered the way her son gripped her hand when she turned to leave. "I smiled," Marlene wrote, "not because I was okay, but because I didn't want my son to learn anger that early." Linda sat in her reading nook, phone in one hand, the other resting on the pages of her journal. She read Marlene's letter twice. Then again. There was no bitterness in the words, just quiet dignity. But it hit harder than rage ever could. "This isn't just my story anymore," Linda whispered to herself. That same night, Linda's inbox pinged with an unexpected subject line, "Media inquiry, interested in interview." It was from a small, independent news outlet that focused on social equity in business. The reporter, Chloe Reyes, explained that she'd been following Linda's platform and was preparing a piece on discrimination in luxury retail. No names would be used without permission, she promised, but she wanted to show how widespread this behavior really was. Linda wasn't sure. The press made her nervous. She hadn't spoken to any journalists. She hadn't even mentioned the name of the dealership publicly. And yet, somehow, her name was now tied to the entire storm. The next morning, David handed her a magazine. He didn't speak, just laid it on the table beside her coffee. The article was short, buried halfway through the business section. But the headline was unmistakable. Wife of energy mogul sparks controversy over snubbed luxury car visit. Social media goes wild over what may be a PR stunt. Linda stared at the page. They hadn't even bothered to quote her. The whole piece was written as if she were a rich woman seeking attention. A bored socialite with a cause. Her jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said softly. David stood behind her, arms crossed. "You want me to respond? I can pull favors, call in names." She turned and looked at him. "No, if we do that, we fight with the same tools they use: power, influence, pressure. That's not the point of this." "Then what is?" he asked. Not angry, just tired. "That people listen, not to me, but to each other." And so she sat down that night and wrote a letter. Not to the magazine, not to the press, to Marlene. It wasn't long, but it was honest. She thanked Marlene for her courage, for trusting a stranger with something so personal. She told her that her words had made her pause, reflect, and commit deeper to what she was doing. And she asked for permission to share Marlene's story with others, so that no one else had to feel as invisible as she had that day in the showroom. A few days later, with Marlene's blessing, Linda published the letter on her personal blog. Not on the anonymous platform. Not through PR. Just her own words, in her own voice. The post spread quickly. Not because of drama, not because of headlines, but because, in a world full of noise, people still recognized truth when they heard it. By evening, the blog had over 10,000 shares. Linda leaned back from her laptop, the last lines of her post still glowing on the screen. Your story gave me strength. I hope, in sharing it, we offer that same strength to someone else. Someone who still believes that dignity shouldn't have to be earned by how you dress or what you own. Outside, the night had settled over the city. But in the quiet, something was moving. Not loud, not fast, but steady. Just like change often begins. Linda's letter to Marlene had been online for barely 24 hours when it started gaining traction. Not viral in the flashy, clickbait kind of way, but steady, persistent, and honest. Like a quiet truth finally spoken aloud. People weren't just reacting, they were responding, sharing, commenting, reflecting. A well-known journalist reposted it with the caption, "This is not about cars. It's about who we decide deserves respect, and who doesn't." A prominent business leader added, "A wake-up call for all of us in customer-facing industries." A civil rights attorney wrote, "Every person who's ever been overlooked because they didn't look the part, this letter is for you." The conversation began shifting. What had started as a single moment inside a luxury showroom was now sparking a broader dialogue. Who gets to be taken seriously in a world obsessed with appearances? The corporate office couldn't ignore it anymore. An internal memo was sent to all showroom managers across the country. Mandatory reviews were ordered for all unresolved customer complaints from the past 3 years. Department heads were instructed to submit weekly reports on customer interaction audits. On the outside, it looked like progress. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. Scott hadn't gone quietly. Though he remained on leave, his connections within the company still ran deep. Word spread that he was trying to identify the leak. He wanted to know who had sent that internal report to Linda. And he wasn't above playing dirty. The anonymous employee, known only as C8 in Linda's files, received an unexpected calendar invite. One-on-one discussion. HR policy compliance. No details, just a meeting time and a closed-door office. Inside the meeting, the questions came quickly, masked with polite tones. Do you recall ever accessing internal customer feedback reports? Were you in contact with any third-party advocacy groups? Have you had any unusual communication with former clients or individuals outside the company recently? C8 gave no names, offered no admissions, just calm, measured responses. When it was over, they were told they could return to work, but with limited access to certain internal systems. Pending review, a silent red flag, and C8 knew exactly what it meant. That night, Linda received a direct message from an unrecognized account. It was short. "I think I'm being watched. Don't contact me for now. Just keep going." She stared at the screen for a long time. The guilt pressed in like a weight on her chest. David noticed her silence over dinner. She finally spoke. "I think someone might lose their job because of me." "No," he said gently. "Because of Scott. Because of a system that allowed him to thrive. Don't carry his sins." "But if I hadn't gone public." David put down his fork. "Then C8's silence would still be protecting someone who never deserved protection. That's not justice. That's fear." Linda nodded slowly, still uneasy. Later that night, she opened her blog again. She didn't draft. She didn't plan. She just wrote. "I never asked for anyone to be punished. I only wanted people to be heard. I never imagined that speaking about my experience, an experience that lasted only a few minutes, would uncover years of silence from others. But now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. To stay quiet now would be choosing comfort over courage. I don't want anyone to suffer because I spoke up. But I also know, if I stop here, someone else will." She clicked publish. The next morning, Linda stepped into a modest event hall in Santa Monica, invited to speak at a customer service roundtable hosted by a national consumer rights group. She wore a soft blue blouse, jeans, and sneakers. No stylist, no talking points, just her story. There was no stage, just folding chairs and coffee in the back. She spoke clearly, her voice steady. "I walked into a showroom to buy a birthday gift for my sister. I left feeling like I didn't belong in the building. Not because I couldn't afford the car, but because someone decided I didn't look like I should be shopping for one." She paused. "That experience was only 5 minutes of my life. But for some people, it's a daily reality." The room was quiet. "I'm not here to be anyone's hero. I'm just tired of pretending that we're past this. We're not, but we could be, if we choose to listen, really listen." As the event wrapped up, the applause came, not thunderous, not performative, but full of something deeper. Recognition. More importantly, Linda noticed the glances between attendees. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at one another. Reflecting. One man near the back leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "I think I might have been a Scot once." That, more than anything else, made her believe she was on the right path. Because sometimes, change doesn't start with a fight. Sometimes, it begins with a question. The invitation came on a Thursday morning. A primly worded email from a major national broadcaster landed in Linda's inbox, requesting her presence on a live televised panel discussion titled, "Discrimination in Luxury Services, The Hidden Cost of Image." Linda read it once, then twice. Her instinct was to decline. She wasn't a public speaker. She didn't want her face plastered on screens. Her story picked apart by strangers with opinions but no context. But that same afternoon, a message arrived from a friend who worked quietly in the company's HR department. C8 has been officially suspended. No warning. They're calling it a policy breach. Linda stared at the screen, her jaw tight. A heaviness settled in her chest. She thought about C8, someone she had never met, someone who had taken a risk not for credit, but for truth, and now they were paying for it. That evening, as she and David sat by the window, she told him about the invitation. "I was going to say no," she murmured, "but maybe I have to say yes now." David didn't try to convince her. He simply nodded. "You're not just telling your story anymore," he said gently. "You're speaking for the ones who never got to." Meanwhile, in a quiet corner booth of a private club downtown, Scott met with a senior executive from the showroom chain. He looked older than just a few months ago, like someone who'd been running uphill while the ground gave way beneath him. "You know this whole thing's a media stunt," Scott said bitterly, swirling the drink in his glass. "They're twisting one misunderstanding into some corporate witch hunt." The executive listened silently. "They're putting her on national TV next week," Scott continued. "It's not about fixing things anymore. It's about smearing names." The executive gave a cautious look. "If it becomes a trial on live television, Scott, there's only one person whose name is on the line. Don't make it worse." Scott didn't answer, but his grip on the glass tightened. The studio was colder than Linda expected. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle under soft, diffused lights. Across from her sat a lawyer who specialized in consumer rights, a hospitality executive known for reforming workplace culture, and the host, a calm-voiced anchor with the kind of face that always seemed to be listening. Linda wore a simple gray blouse, her hair pulled back. She looked exactly as she had when she walked into that showroom, unassuming, composed, present. As the cameras rolled, the host offered a brief introduction, then turned to Linda. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "walk us through what happened that day." Linda took a breath, not for nerves, just to steady her thoughts. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. She spoke plainly, like someone recalling something they still didn't quite understand, but would never forget. "I walked into the showroom to buy a car for my sister," she began. "I was excited. I didn't think twice about how I was dressed. I never imagined that would be the thing that decided how I was treated." She paused, her voice soft. "I wasn't yelled at. I wasn't insulted directly, but I was dismissed, judged, pushed aside, not for what I said, but for what I looked like." The room was silent. The lawyer leaned forward. "And you believe this wasn't an isolated incident?" Linda looked him in the eye. "I don't have data. I don't have surveillance footage. What I have are letters, messages, emails, dozens, no, hundreds, of people who shared their stories with me, most of them far worse than mine." She gestured gently. "It's a pattern, and it's been happening quietly for years." Then, the host glanced toward his producer off-screen and lifted a brow. "We've just received a submission from a viewer," he said, "an audio recording, sent by someone anonymous. It's been verified by our team." A murmur rippled through the audience. The host tapped a button, and a low voice began to play through the speakers. "Those people in gym clothes, jeans, whatever, they shouldn't even be allowed in here. They ruin the atmosphere, waste everyone's time." No name was spoken, but Linda didn't need to hear one. The audience didn't either. When the clip ended, You could hear the faint buzz of studio lights in the silence. Linda didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, almost to herself. That's not just a bad choice of words, she said softly. That's a belief system, one that's been allowed to grow because people either agreed with it or were too afraid to say they didn't. The lawyer looked down. The hospitality executive shifted in his seat. Linda continued, her voice gaining quiet strength. This isn't about revenge. I don't want anyone fired. I don't want anyone shamed. I want something to change. The host leaned forward. What do you want to see happen? She looked straight into the camera. I want people who felt invisible to know they're not. I want the next woman who walks into a place like that, dressed however she wants, carrying her own story, to be treated like a person, not a profile. The audience burst into applause, not loud, but steady, deliberate, like a standing ovation built from truth. Later that night, Linda sat in her hotel room, exhausted but calm. David sent her a message from home. You did it right, it read. You didn't raise your voice. You raised the floor. She smiled, closed her eyes, and let that be enough for now. Outside the window, the city lights blinked in the quiet distance. She wasn't alone anymore, not by a long shot. It started with a soundbite. A 23-second clip, grainy, low volume, but unmistakably clear, circulated on social media like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Morning news shows, opinion podcasts, personal blogs. People like that don't belong in here. The voice said. They cheapen the experience. The internet responded fast and loud. Outrage, disbelief, pain, but most of all, a kind of collective exhale from people who had been waiting for someone else to finally say, it wasn't just me. In response, the national luxury auto chain released a brief press statement. They acknowledged the audio, announced a formal, independent investigation, and, most notably, declared the immediate suspension of their relationship with Scott Miller. But the story didn't end there. Something else began to shift. One by one, former employees, many of whom had once stayed quiet out of fear, started to speak. Their real names now appeared under heartfelt accounts of humiliation, racism, and class-based judgment. Stories once buried in private HR records now flooded the public square. And in the center of it all was Linda, not orchestrating, not leading a movement, but standing still, like a steady flame that helped others see in the dark. Scott, meanwhile, had gone into a self-imposed silence. He declined every interview request, dodged every camera. Behind the scenes, he was gathering a legal team. A lawsuit was drafted, defamation of character, damage to professional reputation, a predictable play. But before it could be filed, something happened that Scott hadn't prepared for. Marlene appeared. The same woman who had once sent Linda a quiet letter of solidarity now stepped onto a national broadcast stage. Her posture was gentle but firm. Her eyes didn't flicker as the host welcomed her. I don't have wealth, she said softly. I don't have connections or lawyers or headlines. But I do have my voice. And I'm done hiding it. She went on to recount her experience in vivid, painful clarity. How Scott had refused to even show her a brochure. How he had made a passing comment about single moms with sticky-fingered kids, and how she had walked out that day feeling smaller than she ever had before. I didn't speak up then, she said, because I thought no one would believe me. Because I was alone. But I'm not alone anymore. The room fell silent. Sitting just a few feet away, Linda reached over and gently took her hand. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. A single still frame of that moment, two women, side by side, fingers intertwined, began to spread just as quickly as the original clip had. But this time, the mood was different. Hope, strength, unity. Days later, at a formal press conference, a representative from the auto chain addressed the public. They issued a direct, public apology, not just to Linda, not just to Marlene, but to every customer who had ever been made to feel less than worthy based on appearance, income, race, or status. We recognize the harm that has gone unchecked, the executive said, and we commit to doing better. They announced a comprehensive overhaul of training procedures, anonymous reporting protections for staff, and a full review of past complaints. Then came a surprising turn. A reporter asked Linda if she had pursued any legal compensation. Linda shook her head. I'm not looking for money. She replied, what I want is progress. She proposed instead that the company fund educational scholarships for the children of women who had been harmed by systemic bias, an initiative aimed not at punishment, but at promise. It was quiet after she spoke. The kind of quiet that comes when something true has been said, and people feel it down to their bones. David was standing in the back of the room, tucked among the journalists and executives, arms folded, watching. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to, but his eyes followed Linda every step she took, steady and full of pride. Outside, a few early autumn leaves had begun to fall. People passing by glanced through the glass windows at the screen where Linda's image remained frozen in that moment, hand in hand with Marlene. Two women who had once been ignored, now standing where no one could look away. For the first time, this wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what could change. And no one could unhear the truth now. In the days that followed the press conference, the air began to shift, not dramatically, not with headlines screaming in capital letters, but with something quieter and deeper. Scott Miller was officially removed from all roles within the luxury auto chain. His name quietly disappeared from the website, his profile scrubbed from internal memos. There was no statement, no apology, not even a brief televised regret. His legal team refused to comment. For a moment, things seemed to go still. The noise on social media dulled. Reporters moved on to fresher scandals, and inboxes finally stopped flashing with the next big reveal. But the echo remained, subtle, strong, and alive. People across the country, people who had never heard of Linda Parker until just weeks ago, began to share their own moments of being looked over, dismissed, or flat out turned away. Women in their 60s who had walked into high-end salons and never been greeted. Immigrants who'd been followed around boutiques. Students wearing sweatshirts who were told the store wasn't for browsing. Even former retail workers chimed in, admitting they'd once been told, directly or indirectly, to pay attention to the ones who looked like they could afford it. Linda received letters, dozens at first, then hundreds, handwritten notes, emails, anonymous messages. Some came with trembling thanks, others with quiet fury. Many just said, "Now I know it wasn't just me." One day, an envelope arrived from a teenage girl in Nebraska who worked weekends at a department store. She wrote, "You reminded me I'm not crazy for thinking the way some of my managers act is wrong. Thank you." Linda read each message slowly, carefully, sometimes more than once. They didn't fuel her ego. They deepened her understanding. Soon after, word got out that several companies in the same industry had launched new internal initiatives, mandatory empathy training, blind service audits, even a campaign titled, "See the person, not the price tag." It was hard to ignore the fact that the slogan had been lifted almost verbatim from something Linda had once said offhand in an interview. Offers started coming in. A well-known lifestyle brand approached her for a campaign around human dignity, offering an eye-watering figure to be the face of their next product launch. David saw the email before she did. He walked into the kitchen, coffee in hand, and said, "It's a big deal. Think about it." Linda glanced at the subject line, then shook her head. "This story doesn't belong on a billboard. It belongs to everyone who lived it. You can't sell that." He smiled, not because he was surprised, but because he wasn't. Then came a call from a nonprofit focused on ethical business practices. They asked Linda to consider joining as an advisor, not as a celebrity face, but someone with lived experience who could help shape their real-world programs. She didn't say yes right away. Truthfully, she wasn't sure she was ready for another identity beyond who she'd always been, a quiet helper. Someone who folded donations and sorted books at the shelter. Not a movement, not a name on a cause. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and bathed their porch in a soft orange hue, David turned to her and asked gently, "If you could go back to that day, back to that exact moment when you walked into that showroom, would you change anything?" Linda leaned back, closed her eyes for a second. The hum of distant traffic was the only sound between them. Then she looked at him and said, "No, if that day had gone right for me, no one would have known how wrong it had gone for so many others." It wasn't about vengeance. It never had been. It was about bringing the invisible into the light. A week later, Linda walked back into the community center where she had always volunteered. There were no cameras, no applause, just a few women chatting over tea, a stack of donation boxes near the door, and a corkboard filled with thank you cards and torn flyers. She slipped off her coat, tucked her bag in the corner, and sat down at the table. A young girl walked up with a hand-drawn card that simply said, "You helped my mom." Linda smiled and added it to the others. That afternoon, before leaving the office of the local outreach program where she'd been helping coordinate new services, Linda walked to the whiteboard in the break room. People had left random quotes and to-do lists there all week. She erased a corner with her sleeve and picked up a marker. In small, clear handwriting, she wrote, "Justice doesn't begin in court. It begins with how we choose to see each other." Then she stepped back, looked at it for a moment, and quietly walked out, leaving behind no signature, no spotlight, just a truth that could not be ignored anymore. Months had passed since that first quiet step into a luxury showroom sparked something far bigger than anyone imagined. The media storm had calmed, but the ripples of what happened hadn't disappeared, they had spread. Gently but firmly, into corners where dignity had long been traded for appearances. The car company, under new leadership and public pressure, launched an initiative called Respect First. It wasn't just a PR campaign, it was a public fund aimed at supporting both customers and employees who had faced bias or discrimination within high-end service industries. Workshops, listening sessions, and policy reforms followed. The tone had shifted, and people began to notice. Marlene, the woman who once stood with her child in a showroom only to be dismissed like background noise, had been asked to be one of the faces of the campaign. She hesitated at first but eventually agreed, on one condition, that her story be told in her own words. Without edits, she sent Linda a photo a few days later, her son beaming beside her in front of their new car. No red ribbon, no sales representative in sight, just the two of them, pride replacing the shame that once clouded their first attempt. The note attached read, "This time, I didn't have to beg. I was simply treated like a person." Linda kept that photo in a small frame on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. And then came news about the anonymous employee, now known to Linda as Jordan. The one who had risked everything to leak the internal report. After a quiet review, the company officially reinstated Jordan, clearing any record of wrongdoing. It wasn't blasted across headlines, just a line in a staff memo. But Linda saw it, and invited Jordan over for dinner. Nothing formal, just a home-cooked meal, warm conversation, and a long overdue thank you said without needing many words. At a community forum a few weeks later, a retired businessman stood and shared his piece. His voice trembled slightly, but his words were steady. "I used to size people up by the shoes they wore, the way they spoke, or whether they looked like they belonged in the places I did. But after everything I've seen this past year, I try to stop and listen now. I try to hear the story before I assume the ending." Linda sat near the back of the room. She didn't raise her hand or speak. She just smiled quietly, her fingers laced with David's beside her. She knew better than to mistake applause for progress. Real change was quieter than that, harder to see, easier to overlook. But tonight, it was here, tucked in between a confession and a promise. After the forum, a young woman in her 20s approached her nervously. "Miss Linda?" she said. "Because of you, I finally applied for a job I'd convinced myself I wasn't good enough for. I just wanted to say, thank you." Linda gave her a small nod, her smile warm but modest. She didn't need to respond. Some moments were big enough to speak for themselves. Later that evening, back at home, Linda opened her inbox to check a few lingering messages before bed. One email stood out. It had no subject line, no sender name, just one sentence. "Thank you. I'm the one who once didn't dare walk into the showroom because I came there on foot." That was it. No name, no need for one. Linda sat back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the window. The streetlights spilled a gentle glow across the front yard. Somewhere out there, people were walking into places they once feared, asking questions they once kept to themselves, and maybe, just maybe, being seen for the first time. The world wasn't fixed, not even close, but it had shifted, ever so slightly, in the direction of something better. And that was enough. At least for now. Sometimes, the most powerful voices don't shout, they wait. And when they speak, they don't just demand justice for themselves, but for everyone who's ever been overlooked. This wasn't just a story about a car dealership, it was a reminder that respect should never depend on appearance, title, or wealth. Have you ever been judged by how you looked? Or surprised someone who underestimated you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets so you won't miss the next powerful story that just might change the way you see the world.